The chair where I always sat was empty this Mother's Day, but not because I forgot to show up. Someone made sure I wasn't invited. I had driven 4 hours to that house every single year, brought flowers, cooked the side dishes my mother always claimed as her own, and smiled through every comment that was designed to make me feel small. This year, my sister called me 2 days before and told me the guest list had changed. She used a soft voice, the kind she always used when she was doing something she already knew was wrong. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, not crying, just understanding finally that I had been chasing something that was never going to chase me back. What I did not know yet was that my grandfather had been watching all of it for years, and that he had spent the last 3 months preparing something that would make that empty chair mean something very different by the end of the day. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something honest. Have you ever worked hard to keep your place in a family that kept quietly moving you out of it? Have you ever shown up again and again for people who only noticed you when they needed something? If that hits close, stay with this story, because what Ackles learned at that table is something a lot of us needed someone to say out loud a long time ago. My name is Ackles, and I am going to tell you something that took me 34 years to fully understand. Being the dependable one in a family is not the same thing as being the loved one. Those two things can exist so far apart that you can spend decades being completely essential to people who would not cross the street for you if the roles were reversed. I learned that truth slowly, the way you learn most painful things, through small moments that you brush off one at a time until there are so many of them piled up that you can no longer pretend the weight is not there. I grew up in a family of 4, my parents, my older sister Renata, and me. My father worked long hours and kept mostly to himself at home. He was not unkind, but he was not present either, not in the way that matters. My mother, Diane, was the kind of woman who filled every room with her personality and made sure everyone in that room knew she was the reason it was worth being in. She loved attention. She loved being thanked. She loved being seen as the matriarch who held everything together, even when she was the one pulling things apart quietly behind closed doors. Renata was 5 years older than me and had learned very early how to use that age gap like a weapon. She was beautiful in a way our mother always praised loudly, social in a way our mother found useful, and obedient in a way our mother found reassuring. Renata never challenged our mother. She laughed at her jokes, agreed with her opinions, and reflected her worldview back to her with a shine on it. In return, she was the favorite, not subtly, not occasionally. Consistently and visibly, and in ways that anyone who spent 20 minutes in our house would have noticed. I was the other one, not ugly, not stupid, not difficult, just not Renata. I got good grades and no one really said much about it. Renata got slightly lower grades and our mother made excuses with a tenderness that I found confusing as a child and heartbreaking as an adult. I cooked when I was old enough. I cleaned without being asked because the asking always came with a sigh that made me feel like a burden. I stayed home on weekends to help while Renata went out with friends and came home late and was greeted with warmth and curiosity and genuine interest in how her evening had gone. I do not say any of this to sound sorry for myself. I am not sorry for myself. I say it because you need to understand the foundation, the thing that was built long before the Mother's Day that changed everything, so that when I tell you what happened, you understand exactly how many years were stacked behind that single moment. My grandfather on my mother's side, a man named Edmund, was the only person in that family who ever looked at me like I was exactly who I was and found that to be enough. He was in his late 70s, slow-moving but sharp in a way that missed nothing. He had spent his working years as a land surveyor, which meant he had spent his life measuring things carefully and noting where the lines were. I think that trained a kind of precision into him that went beyond land. He noticed people with the same quiet accuracy. He noticed who was doing the work and who was taking credit. He noticed who was silent when they should have spoken and who was loud when they should have listened. Grandpa Edmund did not interfere in family politics. That was not his way, but he paid attention. He had been paying attention to me my whole life, and I think I knew that on some level, even during the years when I was too busy trying to earn my mother's approval to really let his quiet support land the way it deserved to. The Mother's Day tradition in our family had been going on since I was in my early 20s. Every second Sunday in May, we gathered at my parents' house, the house I grew up in, now in my mother's name alone after my father passed when I was 26. We brought food, we decorated the table, we made it a full-day event. My mother loved it because she was the center of it, and she was treated like a queen from the moment we arrived until the moment we left. Renata would organize the flowers and take photos for social media. I would cook. I would actually cook from scratch the recipes my mother had always loved, the mushroom soup, the honey-glazed carrots, the lemon cake she requested every single year. No one ever said, "Ackles, thank you for cooking." They said the food was good, the way you might compliment a restaurant. My mother would sometimes say, "This soup is almost right," and then look at Renata and say, your grandmother had a version of this that I always preferred, and Renata would nod along and the conversation would move on, and I would go back to the kitchen and remind myself that I was there because I wanted to be, because I chose to show up. That is what I told myself for years. I chose to show up. I told myself that my choice meant something even when their response to it meant nothing. Then came the Mother's Day 2 years before the one that changed everything. I had been dealing with a difficult period at work. I was 3 years into running my own small event planning business, which I had built from absolutely nothing after leaving a corporate job that paid well but made me feel hollow. The business was real and growing and mine. I was proud of it in a way I had never been proud of anything that someone else gave me. But that particular spring, I had lost 2 large clients in the same month due to a venue partnership that fell apart, and I was financially stretched and emotionally depleted. I still drove the 4 hours. I still brought the food I had prepped the night before. I still set the table the way my mother liked it, the good dishes on the left side, the water glasses filled before anyone sat down. My mother had invited some of her friends that year, women from her church group, and she wanted the house to look perfect. It did look perfect. I made sure of it. At some point during the afternoon, one of my mother's friends asked about the cooking, and my mother said, "Oh, my daughters take such good care of me," and Renata, who had brought one store-bought pie, smiled and accepted the compliment for both of us. I watched that happen. I watched my mother's eyes go to Renata when she said daughters, not to me. And I watched her friend turn to Renata and say, "Your mother is so lucky to have you." And Renata said thank you with a smile that was completely genuine because she genuinely believed she deserved it. I went to the kitchen and I stood at the sink and I looked at the backyard my father used to mow on Saturday mornings, and I gave myself exactly 60 seconds to feel it. Then I dried my hands and went back out and smiled and ate the pie Renata brought. The business recovered. I worked 18-hour days through the summer and pulled it back. By the following fall, I had 4 new clients and had signed a contract with a wedding venue that gave me preferred vendor status, which in event planning is the kind of thing that starts to compound into real income. I also began dating someone. His name was Marcus, and he was a structural engineer who was gentle and curious and laughed easily and treated me like my opinions were interesting to him, which was a new enough experience that it took me several months to fully trust it. I did not bring Marcus to that next Mother's Day. I was not ready to introduce him to the performance. But I told my mother and Renata about him, and my mother asked a few polite questions and moved on quickly. And Renata asked whether he was serious enough to keep, and then told me about a man she had briefly dated who was also an engineer, as if the point of my relationship was to help her find something to compare it to. By the following spring, the year before the one that matters most, Marcus was very much in my life. He had met Grandpa Edmund at a small family dinner, and the two of them had gotten along immediately, talking for 2 hours about city infrastructure and old land records in a way that made me feel warm somewhere deep. Grandpa Edmund had squeezed my arm when Marcus was in the bathroom and said, "This one has patience and he is not trying to impress me," which in Grandpa Edmund language meant he thoroughly approved. I told my mother that I wanted to bring Marcus to Mother's Day that year. She said, of course, the more the merrier. I was happy. I bought a new dress. Marcus and I drove up together and he helped me carry the cooler of food I had prepped, and when we walked in the door, my mother greeted Marcus with genuine warmth. Dee then said to me in the same breath, "Your sister is bringing Daniel this year too. You two can sit at the little table in the breakfast nook. We need the dining room chairs for the older guests." The little table in the breakfast nook, like we were children being sorted. Marcus did not say anything. He set down the cooler and looked at me quietly to see how I wanted to handle it. I handled it by not saying anything and spending the day setting up and cooking in a house where I had been placed at the children's overflow table with my own boyfriend, while Renata and her on-again off-again partner Daniel sat at the main table in the 2 chairs that were apparently more valuable than mine. Grandpa Edmund was at the main table. He saw where I was sitting. He looked at me once across the room and his expression was not pitying. It was simply noting. He was marking something down in that quiet surveyor's way of his, and I did not fully understand what he was measuring until much later. Marcus was wonderful about it. He did not make it a big deal. He helped me carry plates out and made conversation easily, and at one point made Grandpa Edmund laugh hard at something they were talking about, and I thought, at least someone at this table deserves to be here. The day ended. We drove home. Marcus held my hand on the highway and did not ask me to explain myself because he was paying close enough attention to have understood without asking. That night I cried a little, not for a long time, just enough to acknowledge what it had cost me to sit at that small table and pretend it was fine. I told myself next year will be different. I will say something before it happens. I will set a boundary clearly. I did not get the chance. 8 days before Mother's Day of the year that changed everything, my phone rang. It was Renata. She used that soft voice immediately, the one I had learned to recognize as the introduction to something she had already decided. She said, "So I wanted to give you some notice about this year's Mother's Day." I said, "Okay." She said, "Mom and I have decided to keep it smaller this year. Intimate, just immediate family and a couple of her close friends." I said, "I am immediate family." Renata paused 1 second and then said, "We mean the people who are really involved in Mom's day-to-day life, who she talks to most. You know how much better these things go when we keep the numbers manageable." I sat with that sentence for a long moment. You know how much better these things go. As if I were not the person who cooked every year. As if I were not the person who had driven 4 hours twice a year without fail for over a decade. As if I were not the one who remembered which tablecloth my mother preferred and which flowers made her eyes light up and what temperature the soup needed to be to keep her happy. I asked, "Is Marcus invited?" Renata said, "It is really just close family this year, Ackles. I do not think this is a conversation worth making complicated." I said, "You are telling me not to come to Mother's Day at my own mother's house." She said, "I am saying we are keeping it small, and I thought it would be respectful to let you know ahead of time so you could plan something else nice." I did not yell. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories go in your head. I did not scream or cry or say things I would regret. I said, "I hear you," and I ended the call and I put the phone down on the kitchen counter and I felt something shift in me. Not break, shift. Like furniture that has been in the wrong place for years being moved finally to where it always should have been. I texted my mother that afternoon. I kept it simple. I said, "Renata told me I'm not invited this year and I want you to know that I understand and I hope you have a good day." My mother replied 4 hours later with a single line. She said, "It is nothing personal, you know how it is, you know how it is." I have thought about those 4 words many times since that day. I still do not know what they meant and I think that might be the point. They were designed to mean nothing so they could not be argued with. I did not call her back. I did not send a follow-up message. I did not drive 4 hours to stand on her porch and demand an explanation. I stayed home. Marcus made us breakfast and we walked through our neighborhood in the late morning and I told him everything in full for the first time, not just that day but all of it. The soup she compared to her mother's, the little table in the breakfast nook, the years of showing up and being less visible than the store-bought pie. Marcus listened the way he always listened, without filling the silences too fast, without offering solutions I did not ask for. When I finished he said, "I think you already know what you are going to do," and he was right. I just was not sure yet how clear the path was going to become. What I did not know on that Mother's Day Sunday, while I was walking with Marcus and letting myself feel the loss of something I had been pretending was love, was that across town at my mother's house, Grandpa Edmund was sitting at the main table eating food that someone else had cooked, noticing the empty chair and doing something I would not learn about until 3 days later. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon. He called from his landline, which he always did, and when I answered he said, "Ackles, it is Grandpa, I want to see you this week if you're willing." I said, "Of course." He said, "Come on Friday if you can, bring that young man of yours if he is free." I asked if everything was okay. He said, "Everything is exactly as it should be," which was the kind of thing he said when he had decided something with full certainty and wanted you to know the deciding was done. Marcus and I drove to his house on Friday evening. Grandpa Edmund lived in a small yellow house 20 minutes outside of the city, the house he had bought with my grandmother in the 1970s, the house she had died in and he had refused to leave because he said the walls remembered her and that was enough for him. He had dinner ready when we arrived. He cooked simply but well, roasted chicken and bread and a green salad. We sat at his small kitchen table and ate and talked, and when the plates were cleared he went to the sideboard drawer and came back with a large envelope, the kind used for legal documents, and he set it on the table in front of him and looked at me with a steadiness that made the room feel quieter. He said, "I'm going to tell you some things tonight and I want you to listen before you respond." I said, "Okay." He said, "I have been watching your family for a long time and I have watched you in particular because you are the one worth watching, the one who does the real work, the one who keeps showing up even when showing up costs you more than it gives you." He paused and then said, "I watched where they sat you last year and I watched the chair that was empty this year and I made a decision." He opened the envelope. Inside were documents. He walked me through them slowly and carefully, the way a man who spent his life working with precision walks you through anything that matters. The first document was a property deed. His house, the yellow house I was sitting in, had been transferred into my name 3 months prior, quietly and legally, handled by his attorney. I looked at him and he held up one hand and continued. The second document was a financial account statement. He had a modest but significant savings account, money saved carefully over 50 years of working, and he had designated me as sole beneficiary 6 months ago, changing the original designation that had split the account evenly between my mother and a charitable trust. The third document was a personal letter, handwritten, 4 pages in his careful architect-neat handwriting, addressed to me by name. He said, "You do not need to read the letter right now, that is for later, but I want to explain the rest to you in plain language because I believe you deserve to hear it plainly." He said, "Your mother has her house which your father left her and she will be fine. Renata has made her own good life and she will be fine too. What I had to give I wanted to give to the person who reminded me most of your grandmother, who also spent too long making sure everyone else had enough before she asked whether there was anything left for her." I did not cry immediately. I think I was too surprised for crying to organize itself right away. Marcus was very still beside me. Grandpa Edmund poured us all a small glass of apple juice, which was what he drank instead of wine, and he tapped his glass to mine and said, "You were not nothing. You were just surrounded by people who needed you to believe that you were." I cried then. He patted my hand across the table and said, "Now, there is a family dinner at your cousin Sylvie's house in 2 weeks, and I have told your mother and Renata that I have something to share with the family and I would like you there." I asked what he was planning to say. He looked at me over his apple juice and said the truth, which I have been holding for long enough. The 2 weeks between that Friday and the family dinner at Sylvie's house were strange and vivid. I read Grandpa Edmund's letter twice alone on a Sunday morning while Marcus was out running. The letter described things I had not fully seen from the inside, specific moments he had witnessed over the years, a birthday dinner where my accomplishment was mentioned once and then redirected to Renata's news, a Christmas where I had wrapped and delivered gifts on my mother's behalf without her mentioning it to anyone, a phone call he had overheard 3 years ago where my mother told someone that Renata was the daughter she had always imagined having. He had written that last part gently but directly, the way you write something when you think the person reading it needs to KN. How it is true so they can stop wondering whether they imagined it. The letter also said this, and I have it memorized now: "Love that requires you to shrink is not love, it is management, and you have been managed for long enough." I sat with those words for a long time. I also had a conversation with my attorney that week, a woman I had used for my business contracts, who helped me understand the property documents fully and confirmed that everything was properly recorded and legally clean. The house and the beneficiary designation were real and they were mine and they were not a mistake. I had gone into that meeting half expecting to find a technicality, some small error that would make it less true, because that is what happens when you spend your life being told your worth is negotiable. You assume good things are errors. They were not errors. During those 2 weeks, my mother called twice. The first call was a week after Grandpa Edmund had spoken to her about the family dinner invitation, and she was warm in a way she sometimes was when she wanted something, asking about my business, asking about Marcus, saying how much she had missed having me at Mother's Day and that next year would be different. She hoped I understood. I said I hoped so too and kept the call short. The second call came 3 days before the Sylvie dinner and was more direct. She said, "Your grandfather is being mysterious about what he wants to discuss at Sylvie's, and I need to know if you know what it is." I said I thought it was best if we heard it together as a family. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Ackles, you have always been so private," in a tone that made privacy sound like a character flaw. I said I would see her on Sunday. Renata did not call. Renata texted once, a message that said, "See you at Sylvie's, hope things have been okay," as if nothing had happened and we had simply been living parallel lives that were about to cross briefly. I did not respond to it. Sylvie was my mother's younger sister's daughter, which made her my first cousin, and she was one of the few people in that extended family I genuinely liked. She was practical and kind and had a house large enough to hold a dozen family members around a long dining table she was clearly proud of. She had made an enormous pot of lamb stew and fresh bread and had set the table beautifully. When Marcus and I arrived, the family was already mostly assembled. My mother was there in a cream-colored blouse, looking careful in the way she looked when she expected something she was not sure about. Renata was there beside her. Grandpa Edmund was at the far end of the table near the window, and when he saw me he stood up, which he never did without purpose, and he said, "There she is, come sit next to me." I sat next to Grandpa Edmund. Marcus sat beside me. My mother looked at us across the table and I saw something move across her face, a recognition that the seating had meaning, but she did not say anything. Renata looked at her phone. We ate. The lamb stew was wonderful. Conversation moved around the table the way it does when a group of people are waiting for something but pretending they are not. Sylvie's husband made a joke that no one laughed at enough. Two cousins talked about a road trip they were planning. My mother made a comment about the salt in the stew that was technically a compliment, but delivered with a slight upward tilt of the chin that Sylvie acknowledged with a fixed smile. When the main plates were cleared and the table had the comfortable open feeling of a meal that was ending, Grandpa Edmund set down his napkin and looked around the table once slowly, and the conversation softened and then stopped the way it always did when he was about to say something. He said, "I want to tell this family something important while I still have the clarity and the health to say it plainly, and I would like you to hear it the same way." My mother straightened in her chair. Renata put down her phone. He said, "I have been part of this family for 57 years and I have watched how love moves through it and where it pools and where it goes dry." He said, "Some people in families do the carrying and some people do the being carried. And over time, the people being carried start to believe that is simply how things are, that the carriers are built for it and require nothing in return." He said, "I have watched that happen in this family for a long time, and I am old enough now to know that the only thing worse than watching it happen is leaving without saying it was wrong." The table was very quiet. He said, "Ackles has been showing up for this family for over a decade, driving 4 hours, cooking meals that no one credited her for, filling gaps that no one acknowledged, and being placed at the smaller table or removed from the guest list when the carrying was no longer required for that particular day." He said it simply, without theater, the way he would describe a boundary. Line on a property survey: here is where the line is, here is what it means. My mother's face had gone very still. Renata was looking at the table. He said, "I have made decisions about what I leave behind that reflect what I believe, and those decisions are legal and complete and are not something I want argued about at this table or later. What I do want is for this family to understand why I made them. Not because I do not love my daughter," he looked at my mother directly here, "but because love that only moves in one direction is a river that runs dry, and I am not willing to leave behind a legacy that rewards the people who made that river run in one direction only." He paused, he looked at me, he said, "You spent too long believing the empty chair was something you deserved. I want you to know in front of all of them that you deserved the head of the table. That is all I have." The room held that. My mother was the first to speak. She said, "Edmund, I do not think this is the appropriate place," and her voice had the controlled quality it got when she was managing something she had not expected. He said, "I am 81 years old, Diane, and I have waited for an appropriate place for 30 years. I think I have been patient enough." She opened her mouth and closed it. Renata said, "I do not understand what this is about," which was such a surprising thing to say that two cousins looked at each other across the table. Sylvie, bless her, kept her expression steady, but I saw something in her eyes that looked like recognition, like someone watching a door finally open that she had known was stuck for a long time. Marcus put his hand over mine under the table. I did not need to look at him to know what was in his face. What happened next was not a dramatic explosion. There was no screaming, no accusations flung across the stew bowls. What happened was something quieter and in some ways harder to sit with. My mother asked to speak with Grandpa Edmund privately, which he declined without cruelty, saying he had no private conversations left to have on this subject. Renata excused herself to use the bathroom and was gone for a long time. One of the cousins asked Grandpa Edmund a gentle question about what the decisions meant practically, and he answered it plainly. The yellow house in his name was now the yellow house in my name. The savings account, when the time came, would go to me alone. He had informed his attorney and all relevant institutions. The paperwork was filed. There was no ambiguity. My mother looked at me at one point during this explanation and said, "You knew about this," with a tone that suggested knowing was a form of betrayal. I said yes. She said, "And you said nothing to me." I said, "You did not tell me I was uninvited for Mother's Day." Renata did, so I thought we had established that some things are said to some people and not others. It was the most direct thing I had ever said to her at a family table. Sylvie made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. My mother sat with that for a moment and then said, "I have always treated you both equally," which was so starkly different from the letter I had read on a Sunday morning 2 weeks earlier that I felt nothing but a deep settled clarity. I did not argue with her. I said, "I know you believe that," and I left it there because the point was not to win a debate. The point was that I no longer needed her to revise the story. I had the truth from someone who had watched the whole thing, and that truth was recorded in 4 pages of handwriting that I would keep for the rest of my life. The dinner ended, people gathered their things, Sylvie hugged me at the door and said quietly, "Your grandfather has loved you very well and I am glad you know it now." I said thank you. I meant it in ways that went past the surface. On the drive home, Marcus and I did not talk for the first 40 minutes. Not because things were tense, but because there was a lot to let settle. The highway moved under us and the evening light was long and gold, and I watched the fields on either side and thought about the yellow house, the 4 pages of handwriting, the apple juice in small glasses, the way Grandpa Edmund had stood up when I walked in the door. Marcus said eventually, "How are you doing in there?" I said, "I think I feel more like myself than I have in a long time." He said, "That tracks." And then he was quiet again, which is one of the things I love most about him, the way he gives you room to be whatever size you actually are. In the weeks after the dinner, things played out the way they tend to when a truth gets spoken in a room that was used to comfortable silence. My mother called 3 times in the first week. The first call was an attempt to explain the Mother's Day decision as being about logistics, not feelings, and I listened and said I understood without agreeing, which is a skill I had developed over decades but was now using in a completely different way. Before, I had agreed without feeling it, to keep the peace, to avoid the sigh, to not make things complicated. Now I understood without agreeing because I no longer needed her version to be true. I had my own version and a witness to it. That changes everything. The second call was more emotional. She said she felt blindsided by Grandpa Edmund's speech and that she did not think family business should be aired at the table, and I said I understood. That felt uncomfortable. She said, "You have always been the quiet one and I never thought you held things against me." And I said, "I never held things against you, I just eventually stopped pretending they were not happening." She was quiet for a while after that. The call ended without resolution, but also without the old familiar sensation of me shrinking to fill a smaller container. The third call was shorter. She said she wanted to sit down with me properly, just the two of us, and talk through things. I said I was open to that when I felt ready. She asked when that might be. I said I did not know yet and I would reach out when I did. That was honest. I was not punishing her. I genuinely did not know yet what I wanted from a relationship with her going forward, and I was not willing to sit across from her until I understood my own terms clearly. That was new for me, setting terms for myself, knowing that showing up was optional and not a debt I owed. Renata sent a text 4 days after the dinner. It said, "I think Grandpa was out of line and I hope you know that family is family regardless." I read it twice and then typed a reply and then deleted the reply and then sat for a few minutes and thought about what I actually wanted to communicate. What I wrote back was this: "I think Grandpa was the most in line he has ever been and I hope you can hear that honestly." She did not respond. In the months that followed, I visited Grandpa Edmund several times, just the two of us sometimes, Marcus and I together other times. We sat at his kitchen table in the yellow house and talked about everything. He told me stories about my grandmother that I had never heard, about how she had spent years being undervalued by her own family before she built a life that was entirely her own measure. He said, "You come from her more than you come from anyone else in this line," and he said it like it was a fact he had verified through long observation. I started to think differently about the business that year. I had been running it well but always slightly unsure, always slightly braced for the moment someone would point out that I was not as capable as I appeared. That feeling started to loosen. I do not entirely understand why, except that there is something about being seen clearly by someone who has no reason to flatter you that makes the seeing feel more real than any amount of self-talk. Grandpa Edmund saw me and wrote it down in 4 pages and set it at a table, and after that something in me that had been running on borrowed confidence found its own fuel. By that fall, I had expanded the business. I hired a part-time assistant. I signed 2 new venue partnerships. Marcus and I had begun talking about the future in a way that felt less like hypothetical and more like planning. And on a night in October, we sat at our own kitchen table and he asked me in a quiet, unceremonious way whether I would marry him. And I said yes without hesitation, which was how I knew the answer was true. I told Grandpa Edmund first. He laughed and said, "I am not surprised. That man has patience and integrity and he has been ready for that question longer than you knew." I said, "How do you know how long he has been ready?" He said, "We talked about it 6 months ago when you were in the other room at my house. He asked me whether I thought you were in a good place to hear it." I looked at him. He said, "I told him you were almost ready but not quite yet, that you were still working out something important about who you were and that he should give it a little more time." I said, "You told him to wait." He said, "I told him you were worth waiting for." Then he poured 2 glasses of apple juice and we tapped them together again. I want to be honest about my mother and Renata because this story is not one where those relationships disappeared into simple resolution. They did not. I met my mother for that sit-down conversation about 4 months after the dinner. We met at a neutral place, a coffee shop neither of us had strong feelings about, and we talked for 2 hours. She was more honest in that conversation than she had been in any I could remember. She said she knew I had always been different from Renata, and that different had sometimes made her uncertain how to handle me. She said she had not always made the right choices and that she regretted the Mother's Day situation, not in those exact words but close enough that I could receive it. I told her that I loved her and that I was willing to have a relationship with her going forward, but that I was not going to show up in the same way anymore. I was not going to drive 4 hours to cook meals that were not credited. I was not going to attend events where I was an afterthought. She said, "I never thought of you as an afterthought." I said, "I know, and that is part of what we are going to have to sit with together." It was not a full repair, it was the beginning of a different arrangement, one where I had stopped lying about what I needed in order to make the room comfortable for everyone else. That is different from distance. That is choosing presence on honest terms. Renata and I are cordial. We are not close. I do not know if we ever will be. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing that someone you grew up beside never quite saw you as a fellow traveler, only as someone in the way of a destination they were headed to anyway. I feel that grief sometimes. I do not try to make it into something tidier than it is. Renata was shaped by the same family I was shaped by, just in a different direction, and she has her own things to work out that are not my responsibility anymore. Grandpa Edmund is still in his kitchen on Friday evenings, still sharp, still slow-moving, still pouring apple juice with a steadiness that makes everything he pours feel ceremonious. The yellow house is in my name. When I sit in his kitchen now, I look at the walls and I understand what he meant about them remembering. Some spaces hold the shape of the love that was built in them. I want to tell you what I learned, not as a tidy list because real lessons are never tidy, but honestly the way you tell things to someone you trust. I learned that showing up is not the same as being seen, and that for years I confused the exhaustion of constant showing up with the proof that I was trying, as if effort alone was proof of worth. Effort is not proof of worth. You have worth before the effort. You have worth even in the chair you are not invited to sit in. I learned that the people who see you clearly are not always the loudest people in the room. Sometimes they are the ones at the end of the table with a glass of apple juice and a surveyor's precision, marking down the truth without broadcasting it, waiting until the right moment to say what they have always known. I learned that receiving is as much a skill as giving. I had spent so long being the one who gave that when someone gave to me with full intention, I almost did not know how to hold it. I had to practice. I had to sit with the house and the letter and the seat next to him and let it be real and let it mean what it meant. I learned that love is not proved by endurance. Staying in a painful place is not devotion. It might just be fear in a long coat. When I finally stopped driving 4 hours to be placed at the small table, I did not stop loving my family. I stopped agreeing that being placed at the small table was what I deserved. Those are different things, and the difference matters. I learned that Marcus choosing me, really seeing me and choosing me, was something I was only able to receive fully after I started agreeing with the choice. After I started agreeing that I was the kind of person worth choosing. Grandpa Edmund had something to do with that. So did the letter. So did the yellow house. So did sitting at the right table at last and understanding that the chair had always been there. I had just been told it belonged to someone else. The Mother's Day after the family dinner, Grandpa Edmund called me in the morning and sang a small portion of a song my grandmother had liked, which is his version of a celebration. Marcus and I had brunch at a cafe down the street from our apartment, and he gave me a card that said, "For the woman who finally took the good seat." I cried a little bit over my eggs. The good kind of crying, where your body is releasing something that has been held too long and is finally ready to go. My mother sent flowers. A nice arrangement, more thoughtful than what she might have sent a year before. I put them in the window and they were there for a week. I did not call to perform gratitude, but I did send a message that said they were beautiful and that I hoped her day was full of good things. I meant both of those things genuinely. That is where I am now. Not bitter, not distant, not pretending, just honest and present on my own terms. Ackles, who spent 34 years being the invisible scaffolding in a family that never looked up long enough to see what was holding the building up, finally came in from the outside and sat down. Not because she was invited by the right people, because she finally stopped waiting for an invitation and understood that the seat had her name on it all along. Before you go, I want to ask you one real question, and I hope you will sit with it honestly. Is there a table in your life where you have been given the small seat and told to be grateful you were allowed in at all? Have you been the one who cooked the meal, drove the distance, carried the weight, and still ended up invisible when the credit was passed around? If so, I want you to know that what happened to Ackles can happen for you too, not necessarily in the form of a property deed or a handwritten letter, but in the form of one clear decision to stop shrinking so that people who were never going to grow can feel more comfortable. Share this story if someone in your life needed to hear it today. And if you have ever had a moment where someone finally saw you clearly and said it out loud, I would love to read about it in the comments because those moments deserve to be celebrated.